Allora, buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we shall start. Today's session is about work, training, and innovation. So these are the main subjects we are going to address. In particular, we are going to consider a number of observations on how the labor market works and about labor and how people have an attitude towards it. And we'll try to understand how innovation and educational processes can be useful in improving the skills and the attitudes towards work. Let's start with this general remark, which is shared by many people. That is, today, the young generation is experiencing a sense of precariousness and uncertainty, and their needs and their desires seem to be not so clear whenever they start trying to find a job. So we would like to understand whether this feeling, this problem, is attributable just to the way the labor market evolves and the forces underpinning it, from precariousness to globalization, or rather there's other factors on which another positive attitude can be built in entering the labor market. There are examples of many countries where our young people go with the positive elements for relaunching a protagonist role in this respect. In this sense, we feel that this sense of precariousness is not just linked to professions, but it is also linked to lifestyles and the way people face their lives. So maybe this is more of an educational issue and not just a labor market related issue. The second point I would like to raise is this. Education has a positive impact on the ability of young people to have a better career and a better social status. There is unquestionable data today available. All economists and sociologists in the world have reached a consensus on the fact that the more personal and collective investment in education, the better are the positive benefits generated. Still, our country is a country where our young people may not be studying enough or may studying too much. Some people are insisting that more practical training should be provided rather than more general education. The data tell us that the percentage of people with a degree in our country is considerably lower than the people that graduate in Europe and in the rest of the world. Considering these data, it is hard to claim that there is a surplus of formal skills in our country, at least as far as tertiary education is concerned. The third point is this. What are the skills and educational areas that should be considered in our country? There is some particular features here in our country. In particular, the role of soft skills are very much taken into consideration now. That is, young people entering the job market now, they need to have basic skills, which are now unquestionable. The capacity of reading, understanding texts, and finding information, understanding whether a piece of news is real or fake, organizing meetings, being able to make calculations with at least some elements of statistics. So these are really fundamental competencies as hard skills in our society. However, today the debate is also focused on the possibility of developing also more cross-cutting skills, more informal skills, soft skills that are a feature of successful stories in professional context. It is the ability to work in a team, the ability to interact with other people, to public speaking skills, the ability to understand the setting in which one operates, and so on and so forth. So those involved in education should really understand whether these skills can be nurtured, can be transmitted, or they are innate. Can these skills be worked on in school settings, or are these just part of a family, of one's background, of one's story? This is really important because those who are offering a job after the educational background of a person may be in need of these skills, and so they consider them to try to find the best candidate, and this is important to give orientation to our students. The last point I would like to consider is that among the objectives of education, there is the possibility to have a social movement upscale in the society, and this is maybe not achieved. It is important really to insist on this because this seems to be very much linked to one's background of origin. So this is a challenge for education that must be met, faced, and defeated, understanding how educational tools can improve one's professional and life condition compared to the previous situation. So this is so important also in the current labor market, indeed. We will consider these subjects with the three distinguished guests. I am very grateful to them for being here. First, we have Mr. Maximo Ibarra, who is an important manager in our country. He has been attending the meeting in Rimini for a few years now, so thank you for coming back again. Many of the activities of these guests are already well known, so we can just briefly hint at them. He was CEO of a wind company, and he also teaches at the Lewis Business School, so thank you for being here. The second speaker is Mr. Matteo Marzotto, who is involved in so many activities, and the main activity today is that he's a vice executive president of Italian Exhibition Group, that is the company of the Fiera di Vicenza and Fiera di Rimini. He is part of the board of directors of many activities in Italy and abroad, so thank you so much for being here with us today. And finally, Mr. Mario Mezzanzanica. He is professor at the Bicocca University of Milan, where he teaches information systems. He deals with the use of data to support strategic decisions in policies in different fields. He is director of the Master in Big Data at the University of Bicocca, Milan. So we invite him also to consider the subjects I mentioned before, and I want to thank you for accepting our invitation. So I would like now to give the floor to our speakers and ask them to consider 4 questions, and you are free to decide which you want to address in detail. You have a very privileged position from which you can see the reality of these young people entering the labor market. So what are the main elements of uncertainty that you find in these young people? What are the suggestions that you can give them to overcome these uncertainties? And what are the strengths, the main strengths that you find in these young generations, and how it is possible to build on them? Second question, what is the role of educational institutions in educating these young people? How are universities and schools working to also educate and train in these soft skills, and how can they be improved? If you also want to add the comments on some of the novelties in the current debate, about this, for example, the school job systems or reducing high school attendance by 1 year, you are very welcome. The third point is about innovation. So innovation is linked to the attitude to be able to change. It's a soft skill that is so important. Is one person born with it or is it made? How can companies be stimulated to improve the development of these competencies? And then finally, a personal question. So our title of the meeting refer to the fact that to earn what we received by our fathers, it is necessary to possess it, to earn it in order to possess it. So what does this mean compared to the attitude to one's work, to one's job, and what does it mean to earn something that we received as a tradition? So our session is organized in a way that each of the speaker can give us 10 minutes, 15 minutes talk, and then we'll have a second round of comments. So we start with Mr. Ibarra. Thank you again. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to be here. And as you mentioned, it's my 6th year at the meeting and the 5th year as a speaker, so it's always a really great pleasure. I would like to make a number of comments which are a mixture of the questions that you raised, because focusing on all those questions, I would really need more than 10 minutes. In my experience, well, my experience is a mixed experience. As you mentioned in the introduction, I worked for big companies. I was managing big companies until not long ago, and I have tried also to work in education at the university at the same time. So I had a chance to have a look at the same reality from two different standpoints. So it was a privileged position in a way, in particular when it comes to young people entering the labor market. What is the gap between the educational needs and eventually the needs of companies, because companies need people with certain skills, with certain features that can really fulfill their tasks. So this is my point of view, but I also want to make a comment on the current world. This is something I always like to tell, that is that change today in terms of units of time is much more critical than it used to be 10 years ago. I mean, the change in one day today is equal to the change that used to take place in 1 year in the past. This is, of course, an exaggeration, but it's to give you an idea of the notion I wanted to share with you. So this really makes everything much more difficult, understanding what the skills should be, the kind of education, because technology advances, technology makes progress. It's not just technology, but also the way technologies interact between each other, and they grow exponentially. So it is not possible to observe a reality with calm, but we have to be observing these realities in a dynamic way. So if this is the context, it is necessary to act on the hard skills that you mentioned, but also the soft skills, because to govern change and the speed of this change, then the person again acquires a protagonist role with his or her own features, the characteristics, the DNA, empathy, the ability to interact with other people, looking at the world as a whole, connecting individual points, being able to be in tune with the setting around him or her. That's very important. So if this is the premise, in my experience, I have created some situations that have enabled me to exploit these skills. Some examples. How would you select a person who's just graduated or who's just finished school and is about to enter a big company? Of course, a company has enormous needs from many different points of view. Companies are made of different functions, so many times there are people that are sought for commercial skills or for their chart skills. There are different skills that are required of the small and medium and big companies and that are fundamental to be able to carry out one's task, one's job. And then I would like to deepen more on the kind of companies that we all think about, a concept that may be obsolete now. So the first question about a person entering any of these functions is what are the skills that are needed? What is the experience? What is the background of this person? There's no background, there's no great experience because these people have just finished university. So over the last few years, I've tried to focus on the characteristics of the persons because the premise to me is that the basic skills have already been acquired by the young man or woman in the faculty of economics or law, and so their ability to work together with other people in a context that is changing very fast is so important. I mentioned before the fact that certain attitudes towards companies are obsolete. Think of an organization that is structured into individual units. Well, that's a totally wrong approach because change now is forcing us to consider interaction between the different units that are working in a completely different way compared to how they used to work before. So if we think that we want someone who can work just on marketing, well, that's not good because marketing skills should not be ascribed just to a restricted group of people. That's a wrong approach. This should be revised so that organizations can turn from vertical organizations to transversal organizations. So also the people working in those organizations must become more transversal, get in touch with other competencies, put them together and find solutions that are not traditional classic solutions, but are the solutions that are sought to overcome to face the change that is so fast. I could give you so many examples of things that are going on, and it is impossible to make forecasts in 3, 4 years because everything runs so fast and science and knowledge interact so fast. It is really impossible to understand what our destiny is, but we know that speed will be really fast. So it is important to focus more on what the features of a person are, the characteristics of people. So if we consider a young man or a young woman entering the labor market, starting to work in a company, well, the ability to be able to be in tune with the different units in the company without never stepping back is really important. But if one thinks that he or she is going to do the same job forever, that's not going to be useful. And then what happens when there are people who already work in big companies and that have also contact with the universities or the schools? It is necessary to manage what is the reskilling, that is, training and educating people who already work in a company. Again, I have many examples here. There's, for example, people who have been working in customer care for many years, and after a retraining process of 6 months, they started to work in information technology. So one may wonder, how can a person who's been working for customer service then work in information technology? They are two opposite things. Well, they're not so opposite because to do information technology, you need to know the customer. And very often, those working in technology, they do not know about the clients. But the person who knows about the client can know technology, and you do not need to be able to code and to write scripts, but you need to know how to work with technological tools to provide a better service to clients. And this experiment gave very positive results because those involved just in technology would see the problem from a vertical point of view, whereas these people had a transversal approach. So they were able to embed in the technology world the heart of the client with their preoccupations, with their claims, with their worries. So that was a really interesting experiment. Another experiment then refers to the concept of open innovation. This means that companies do not really need to innovate internally only, but they also have to talk to the external world. There are startups, incubators, and venture capital. So this is a reality that has to be considered because there are so many young people that decide to start new businesses based on more of an instinct or a curiosity, and they really generate important realities, interesting realities that can also be used by companies to perform their activities. Instead of wasting time recruiting people to find people with those competencies, well, we should already look for people that are already present in the market with with those skills. So those inside the company can innovate, and those outside the company have a client with which to start doing some business. Open innovation that I most like is the internal one, because going back to the previous point and of transversal skills, or the fact that vertical organizations should not exist anymore, if one manages to put together people working in different units that maybe have been working in the same duty for a long time, and manages to free them of that kind of restraining context, and they are put together in a context where they have to bring more innovation, then results can be really overwhelming. I have done this in my career many times. I, for example, organized this wind factory activity initiative in the wind company. The youngest recruited people were, for example, considered also those that were best in the soft skills, and people that were not really so young, but they were experts in the different functions where they were working. And the results were really amazing in all the fields, because the young people with a lot of talents, they had a lot of energy. There was more innovation in terms of new ideas, but the more expert people that have been working for more years in the company were more innovative in terms of process. So how to best serve some clients, because trying to put together information from other colleagues, many interesting things could be carried out. This experience also helped me in the past to free some resources, financial resources, to implement what was created by people that started something in a completely new setting, that were free to innovate without a specific task to fulfill. This internal open innovation should be performed more and more by companies, so that these companies can be ready to deal with the increasing dynamism that will put these companies under pressure in some cases. In other cases, they will force the companies to look for new solutions. This is another experiment that I think should be implemented more and more in order to be able to carry on one's business activities, and also, above all, to create an intelligent ecosystem that can free resources and potential that is necessary. The last point I wanted to raise with regard to today's session is that to fill the gap between offer and demand, that is, that we have the companies asking for certain skills, and then education institutions, schools and universities, there must be more dialogue. That's the solution. It is not possible for a university or for a school to understand what is needed without a strong dialogue, a constant dialogue, and an increasing deeper dialogue with the companies that are those subjects that have specific demands for skills, not just in terms of know-how, but also in terms of practical activities. So this is already there, but it can be performed but much better, because the universities and schools can also give very interesting ideas to the companies, and companies can also give interesting ideas to the schools, so that they can both work as if there were a kind of collaboration. That we have had this collaboration until now, but at a minimum. So this must be done increasingly, because it is not possible to work individually. To conclude, just a comment on what we mentioned before. Coming here, when we talk about innovation and we talk about young people in the labor market and outside the labor market, it is important to remember that the person is at the center of everything. That is the young man, the young woman in the school. So I invite those involved in education in schools and in universities is not to assess students as if there were mass standardization. People are different, they have different characteristics that make those people unique. So if we are able to understand what these unique characteristics are, what the talents are, it will be possible to lead those young people to become passionate about some specific subjects or some other areas. And then it will be possible to favor this ecosystem between demand and offer, between companies and schools and universities. This is fundamental, and without this idea clear in mind, it is very dangerous because we run the risk of have a discrepancy between what the companies ask for and what the school and the universities offer. Young people can best work when they have the best orientation about their skills and their attitudes. Thank you.
Grazie mille.
Thank you very much. This is quite interesting food for thought, and we can go even deeper with these remarks. And I'll leave the floor to Mr. Marzotto. Well, it's not easy for me to talk after listening to the previous speakers, and they have very clear ideas when it comes to these topics. Well, I agree with virtually everything that was said by the previous speaker, but I would like to start with a forward, so to say. Thank you for having me here. I've been invited other times to the meeting, but due to other engagements, I've never managed to take part in one of the sessions of this meeting. But today I am one of the contributors to this new entity, which is called Italian Exhibition Group, and I am glad to tell you I was the president of the National Agency for Tourism several years ago. However, AG is the first entity of this kind, merging two exhibition entities, Rimini and Vicenza, setting aside all the trend to look for your own village, and so you are the witnesses of quite an epochal event, because no other two entities have managed to merge like as we did with the exhibition entities of Rimini and Vicenza. So we should focus on positive aspects, but we have some concerns as well. And I would like to refer to my own experience. I am the fifth son in my family. My parents were a little bit too indulgent for me, and well, they did not focus on my education. I was a disaster when it comes to school and to education. But because of unforeseeable events, I got so passionate about the history of my family, and specifically of my grandfather Gaetano, that in order to upgrade myself, so to say, I decided to educate myself on my own when I was when I had already grown up. So I do not have any university degree. One day I will have a university degree, and I will be able to be called dottore in Italian. But in the meantime, I do whatever I can. I found motivation in myself. I look for motivation every day. It is not necessarily an economic, financial motivation. I'm lucky in all senses of the word. I've also done disasters, and I acknowledge this. I worked for many companies, and I almost always managed to create values to the companies. But when I worked for myself as a self-employed, well, I made some mistakes. I need to acknowledge this, and so I am now criticizing myself, and I would also like to criticize the school system, because the school system does not teach you to lose. It only teaches you to have points of references, targets, and it only teaches you to win. I found an extraordinary man in my family, my grandfather, Gaetano, and his personality and his achievements were used as a stimulus, as a driving force. I know I cannot be as good as my grandfather was. Yet today's society and what revolves around society continues to propose models which in many cases are misleading models. And again, when it comes to the topic of the topics dealt with by the meeting in this week, well, I have to say that it's not easy to get inspiration from a sentence by Goethe's Faust. If you consider that the meeting is organized by Communion and Liberation. But I have to say that, well, it was audacious on the part of the organizers. We are always on the brim. We are always sort of borderline between the evil and the good. So I said, I'm speaking personally from my own personal point of view. So I said at the beginning that I was sort of a donkey at school. I did disasters. But I had a chance to travel around the world, and I've tried to understand the world. I've turned 50. I'm no longer a young person, but in Italy you can be young until you reach the age of 80. But well, at 50, I can say that I still am a young man. I've tried to look at the others, and I've tried to get inspiration from other countries as well. I focused on training and on the schooling system of other countries, neighboring countries, and not to mention faraway lands. And I have a precise idea of the virtues of the Italians. I am the head of I have a foundation dealing with research in a genetic disease. One of my sisters died because of this genetic disease, and I can say that the Italians are an extraordinarily generous people. Even in the years of the economic crisis, my foundation managed to raise 3 times as funds vis-à-vis the past situation, in a period in which Italy lost 12 points of its GDP. And I can state and I can declare that Italy, from the northern regions to the most southern point, always reacts positively when it comes to helping foundations and helping worthy people. Italy has become a brand, one of the most outstanding brands when it comes to the way of living. There is a possible market because the world considers Italy as one of the best places to live. We are serial individualists, and it is difficult for us to focus on positive aspects, but I can tell you that I've had many positive experiences, many favorable experiences, and we as Italians tend to complain about ourselves, and we tend to talk bad about ourselves. The press, the media only focus on negative news. I would like to have a law which determines for the fact that if for each bad news you are also compelled to give a good news. In this way, because otherwise it is easy to understand that it's not worth watching the TV news, because each time you watch a TV news in Italy, well, you are totally dismalled. So, as for the title of this year's meeting, well, re-earning. Well, I'm trying with all my limits to re-earn, and I'm trying to deserve a name, a surname, which is an important surname in the history of Italy. Marzotto is a surname which has made my ancestors reputable and renowned. I've also left my family. I've had quarrels with my parents, with my relatives, but I believe that you can live your own adventure without resorting to false myths. And as Vittorio Alfieri said, well, Vittorio said, I really wanted, and I strongly wanted it. Well, I will say something bad maybe, but I'm not convinced. And then I will listen to what the next speaker has to say. I am not convinced of the fact that in Italy, this generation, let's say the next generation, has a strong motivation as there was a strong motivation in the past generations. I'm trying to measure and to pick up the words, to select the words that I'm telling you. I'm wondering now, from an observatory, well, the Gaetano Marzotto Prize, conceived by my family, it is a prize for innovation. It is a prize on innovation. In Italy, in Europe, we give almost 3 million euros per year as an award, as a prize. So it's not a symbol. It's a complex system. It is now in its 7th year of existence, and we receive about 650 applications every year. Applications must be sent only online. We have incubators, dozens of incubators, accelerators. We work with universities. We've started with one university in particular. We are also involved with large institutions, banks, for instance, Unicredit. We deal with training, and we also gratify and award by training. I've had a recent experience in a business school, so I am passionate. I really work a lot, and I do not earn so much as I would like to earn because of my work. But this is what I like to do. So these points of observation make me say that there is a sort of mechanism according to which we have a top part of the society. We have an hourglass, people being lucky enough to have families who can give them the necessary instruments to get the best training, and they accept this challenge. And in at the top end of this hourglass of the ladder, we have startups, which in many instances have their own professor and 3 other people who are the operating people. In the Marzotto Foundation, we consider the legal entity. So we do not take into account the ideas, and we follow 3 logics: economic sustainability, innovation. These are the 3 drivers of my grandfather. And finally, the 3rd driver is the social repercussions on the territory. And this was an old motto of the Marzotto family. And I can tell you that I probably saw the best Italy possible, the most competitive Italy, entering the large companies, and a part of the country which should be valorized and enhanced by managers. I know that we should be more transversal, but this is also the case in life. Then you end up by being a sort of Mr. Know-it-all. But if we had a manager who knows all about everything, you could really earn lots of money. And I can tell you that you can learn something at every age of your life. From my own experience, I can tell you that there are almost 300 people working with me, and over the last few months we've been reasoning on the real integration of the 2 organizations. And we are also considering a possible entry into the stock exchange. And all these reflections, all these remarks will have to be pondered every day. And I think that Vicenza plus Rimini is going to be something plus something else. It was not a financial transaction. It is an industrial operation. And in this case, we need to have people functioning well. You create added value only if you mediate and if you create added value on the job of people, on employment of people, transforming goods or services. We, of course, transform services. We have 62 exhibition products, 59 of which are property products. So we do have the factory, and we need to have the factory working. The negative aspect of my contribution is that because of its physical shape, the hourglass gets thinner, and I'm not sure about what remains in the most restricted part of the hourglass. The unemployment has increased. We all know it. Italy lost 12% of its GDP when I was part of the Italian entity for tourism. Of course, I focused on the figures because I needed to have an entrepreneurial approach, and the figures were really complicated. They were really complex. So you will understand why I started from the ENIT, from the Italian tourism agency. Tourism in Italy is worth 10% of the GNP. There are 2.5 million people involved in the tourist sector, plus the footprint revolving around foreign tourists, most of all. Tourists coming to Italy, spending their money, sleeping in hotels in Italy. And there was a lot of confusion, and with the ministry at that time, we tried to arrange things a little bit. We asked to the Bank of Italy, to Union Camere, to have one individual observatory, and we really found out very interesting data. Why am I saying this? Well, because we tend to speak about evident topics in Italy. And I can tell you that it is my opinion that tourism in Italy is worth far more than 10% of the GDP, for a series of reasons that you all can imagine. It's not easy to list them. However, I believe that in this economic aspect, Italy has become poorer over the last few years. But there was not a crisis, and it was not inevitable. In 2009, in 2008, I wrote a small book which had no pretension. It was a charity project for an important publisher. But I was asked to write the book, and the part of the earnings went to my foundation on cystic fibrosis. So I wrote a small book about 7, 8, 9 years ago on what I thought at those times. The crisis had not begun yet. And I think that the years that followed the so-called dot economy, so 1996 onwards, probably you will remember the Tiscali financial bubble. And I wrote at that time that those things were not sustainable. I was then engaged in a very important company dealing with fashion brands. Then I started to be the manager of Valentino brand, and I remember that you sat in front of 30, 40 analysts, and they were aged 30, 35 years old. If you didn't have a growth by 2 digits, you were judged as being in crisis. So that situation could not last, and I knew it. Merrill Lynch invented the basket of luxury goods in 1997, 1998, where it included companies dealing with luxury goods, from luxury aircrafts to fashion brands, jewels, shipbuilding yards, and that became a sort of a point of reference. But then in the end, it was a container, a basket containing everything. So it was not so reliable in the end. But when it was created, it was the system was worth 120 billion euros. It's now worth the double. And so Italy got poorer, but there's another part of the world which in turn became richer and richer. When I was a kid, there were about 800 million people who were our reference market, but today probably we have 4.8 or 5.5 billion people who have access to a life which is a lifestyle which is similar to Italian lifestyle. And so they require services. So I will end up by saying that we need to be passionate. We need to be willing to improve our situation. We need to learn foreign languages. You can learn a foreign language with free apps if you want. You can learn a foreign language because you are passionate about a specific culture, because you're passionate about movida in Spain, for instance, or because you're passionate about music, whatever you want. You can be passionate about sports, but you must have the willingness and the desire to learn foreign languages. The greatest problem that I can see today is that I'm surrounded by people who are constantly complaining about something. They are disappointed. They are unhappy. I'm talking about a part of that pyramid, of course. I cannot generalize. But what I see is that most of Italians are not even eager to learn English. All the rest of the world, if you go to the Balkans, you will find the majority of people talking at least one foreign language. And you cannot state that they talk English because they are a minority. I don't know if anybody of you has ever been to Germany or to Scandinavia. You can move to Germany tomorrow morning, and you can speak English perfectly and being integrated perfectly in Germany, at least for basic functions of life. So please imagine a person coming to an Italian province, speaking only in English. And if this person does not find anybody who speaks English, just imagine how difficult it can be for this person to integrate into the Italian society. So bear in mind all the beautiful and positive aspects that I see around me. Well, I would also like to stress the cons and the negative aspects. I will not talk to you about my ideas on the 1968 and the cultural revolution of the time, but I think that we should not simply focus on the fact that young people are to be considered a disappointed generation because their future was stolen from them. Who is to blame for this? And I don't think it's the right way to think about our current situation like that. Thank you very much.
Anche da questa relazione un paio di...
So there are a couple of remarks that I will ask you later on to further explain.
Grazie anch'io per l'invito.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the invitation. I will also refer to the last question asked by Tommaso, and I also want to start with a personal anecdote. My dad was a worker, and when I became a university professor, I went to see him that evening. He was having dinner, and I told him, well, I got a position at the university as a university professor. And he raised his head and looked at me and said, good, when do you start working? And I just got at a halt. I couldn't really react. So what is it about when we talk about our fathers, our parents? I wanted to give you this example because when I analyze labor market data, I always remember my dad and what he told me when do you start to work. So what is it about when we think of our fathers, our parents? To my dad, know-how was really important. He was a showmaker. And I want to quote this sentence. In the past, workers were not servants. They were cultivating an honor, an absolute honor. The head of the leg had to be well built, not because of the salary or proportionately to the salary. That was not needy for the boss or for experts, neither for the clients of the owner, but it had to be done well by itself. This is a quote from Peggy in 1914, and I think that it really expresses pretty well the position of our fathers. An absolute honor, as is the case in all honors. And this is the position that characterized the post-war period and the growth that our country had at that time. My colleague and friend Giorgio Vittadini wrote in Sussidiario so many eyes that contributed for the first year of the Republican history to making Italy one of the most developed countries in the world and so rich in innovation and creation and production. All people, the qualified and unqualified workers, nationals and non-nationals, labor has been the unifying point and the qualifying point of our country. This was a time when our fathers worked, and at the end of their professional career, they would leave their place, their position to their sons and daughters. That's not the case anymore. If we want to talk about labor and innovation, we need to really understand very well what we are talking about. And my colleagues here have mentioned already some important elements. The first difference has been mentioned also by Max Ibarra, is that labor is changing very fast. I think that speed of change is one of the main features of the labor market of today. And the situation is not easy for our country. Just to give you some data, some figures, in 2003, our country had 61.1% employment rate. That is participation of those who are in an active age to the labor market. 56%. In 2016, we went to 57.3%, so it grew by 1.2 percentage points. Very, very little. Basically, we are the third last country in Europe for labor market participation. On the other side, if we consider unemployment, we had higher positions in Europe because we are the fifth country in terms of unemployment rate, the highest unemployment rate. So in this case, we are champions. We had an unemployment rate after which we have only Germany, Spain, Croatia and Cyprus that was 11.9%, where the average European Union is 8.7%. What really have struck me is to put these 14 years all together. We had the governments from the right wing, from the left wing, technical governments, and also, I can't really define them, there were governments that were mixed between right and left wings. And many reforms of the labor market have been made. let's consider the implementation of these reforms, and we see the following year almost always, I won't refer to the specific ones, I won't tell you which one haven't created any progress. We see a progress of the employment rate for a year, and then they go down again. In 14 years, going from 56.1 to 57.3 is really little. I can express this in a rough way. All these reforms that have been made basically have not changed the structure of our labor market. They have given some contributions that have been positive in certain moments, but without them, we wouldn't even be at this level. It would have been lower. So they didn't change the structure in a significant way. This is a problem for our country, especially for those who have the biggest problems in our country. For example, young people and women with high rates of unemployment, and then differences between the areas of our country. The south of our country has a much worse situation than the north of our country. So there's big generational differences and also big territorial differences. Let us try to understand what to do and what may happen. I think one of the fundamental points is trying to understand how change has taken place. I said before that the speed of change is probably one of the most important features of the labor market. But how has labor changed over the years? Because labor is not the labor of our parents anymore, of our fathers anymore. Labor has changed in these terms. The first change can be defined in terms of mobility. Mobility did not exist for our fathers because their career for 35 years would develop in the same company for then leaving that place to one's children. But mobility today is one of the features of people's careers. People change jobs, they change contracts, they change economic sectors, they go to live to other places. So mobility becomes a fundamental sector of the one's labor experience. Mobility means change, and it also means being ready for people to understand what are the factors that can help me take advantage of the boost of mobility. The other point that I think is particularly important, well, sorry, I go back to mobility once more. Only in our country, mobility is linked to the notion of flexible contracts, but that's not the way it should be. We have analyzed millions of contracts, permanent contracts that have been made over the last few years, and what really have stricken more is that more than 50% of permanent contracts between 2009 and 2016 ended after 3 years. More than half of those contracts have been terminated after 3 years. We have an estimation of this that should be about 10 years, but there's a big mobility. More than 50% change their job. It's because they also have the opportunity to do so. Sometimes they are forced, and the companies change too, and the cycle of products and services and companies is much, much faster now, and this favors this concept of mobility. The second point I wanted to mention is that also jobs change, professions change, what people do in their job, and for example, digital competencies are a critical factor there. Digital skills are becoming increasingly important in fulfilling tasks that are not just linked to ICT or to technological information, but these are also crucial in traditional jobs. We have analyzed more than 2 million job announcements published on the web by the companies, and we have tried to understand in the different professions what the skills required are. And it was interesting to see that digital skills become important, for example, for those who deal with the logistics. So when staff for logistics are sought, the requirements are that digital skills should be available. They have to be able to use certain tools, and this even increases for accountants. There's a 30% impact, and for marketing position we have 40% presence of these skills. So performing a certain job today is changing because we see that following the change of the labor market is really important. Then the other aspect concerns polarization of professions. What is emerging from the labor market is that there are more and more requests for low-level skills people, and then medium positions are replaced by robots. So there is a polarization between high skills, high specializations, and low skills. We have created a labor market system based on medium-level skills, and this is a problem in our system. And the last point refers to the continuous growth of new professions. Innovation technology, especially in the big data area or analytics or for Industry 4.0 or the new services, for example, in the telephone industry. Well, in all these areas, new jobs are created, and this has a strong impact on the fact of being ready. In this case, there is a huge gap between offer and demand. There is much more demand on the part of companies for these new professions than there is availability in terms of people ready and educated in those areas. So here, educational institutions must be able to adjust to respond to market needs. That's fundamental. What are the causes of these changes? These changes are caused by changes in the economy and in society in general that have happened over the last few years. In a book by Moretti, who moved to Berkeley to work, the American economy of the last 50 years is analyzed, and he identifies as a factor for change the shift from an economy based on material production to an economy based on knowledge and innovation. He refers to a new scenario in which the key ingredient for occupation, for employment, consists of human capital. The scenario also sees that the fundamental production factor is made of persons because they generate new ideas. And he also says that for the first time in history, the most important economic factor is not physical capital or raw materials, but human capital and its creative capacity. So the changes that have an impact on labor are originated by changes that are taking place in the wider context of the economy and production systems. The most important primary factor was made of raw materials and resources in the past, but now economists agree on the fact that it is the person, the primary factor on which investments should be made. Nobel Prize for the Economy, Ekman, an authoritative scholar, claims that for modern labor, a man equipped with a complete personality is required, and not a man that is just trying to be successful but detached from reality. In these changes, the I is the one that can make a difference to face the challenges ahead of us. Considering now the subject of young people, I was really interested in working with Giorgio and other colleagues to prepare this exhibition about work and the labor market that is available here at the meeting. I invite you all to visit that exhibition. It's really nice. So what happened with these 30, 40 young people involved at the beginning of their work experience and at the beginning of the creation of their family? We had a dialogue with them about job-related issues, and a lot of questions have emerged. For example, when can a job be really useful for oneself and for the others? What are the criteria to select a kind of job? Can somebody accept a job even if he or she doesn't like it? And is there a job that is so demanding that cannot give you any free time? And how can there be an efficient management of family duties and job-related duties? What should be considered at the very beginning of one's career? Is it salary or is it being satisfied? These questions are part of people's life, and they tell us that for the labor market, for the job, these questions for these people must be there, first of all, because they are there, and cannot just find theoretical answers. Having this dialogue with them, one way to find an answer, we didn't want to be professors and tell them how things should have been, but we tried to find people who were involved in certain jobs to give their experience, and that's the key of the exhibition. The questions were asked to people who were working and learn from their experience. So let's go back to experience. This meeting with people's experience is what have started to teach us that these questions are part of everyone's experience. Employees, managers, entrepreneurs, workers. And facing these questions means trying to come to terms with the idea that one's have of himself or herself. Or, as was mentioned in the introduction, this is a question of education. It is a question of education, first and foremost, being able to refund the labor market today. It is important that these personalities, these subjects, really come to terms with what they really love. And this can be done in people's education. That's why formal education has such an important role with respect to what happens then in the labor market, also in the ability to establish relations with other people. This is so fundamental for the growth of these subjects. And I would like to conclude with what I think may be one of the prime characteristics of education, by quoting Saint-Exupéry, who said, if you want to build a ship, do not just gather men to pick wood and distribute the tasks, but teach them the nostalgia of the endless ocean. I think this is the position that we need today to change the labor market. Thank you.
Grazie, professor Mezzanzanica.
Thank you very much, Professor Mezzanzanica. I don't know what you think about the speakers, but I am grateful to you all for the food for thought that you've given us and for the things you've said. Well, I've learned a lot from your contributions, and I would like to involve you in a sort of a mission impossible. I've noted down some hints, a couple of hints for each contribution, and I would like to ask you to give us your feedback. I will give you 5 minutes each because we need to end this session by 1 p.m. and I would like to start with Maximo Ibarra. There's an aspect about what you've told us which impressed me. I always try to understand the features, the characteristics of a person before deciding to hire this person and for which job. So how can you do that? If I were a candidate and I come to you and I have an interview with you, what would you evaluate? Well, first of all, I would hire you. Don't worry. And there's another aspect linked to this. You've talked a lot about transversal companies, and then you ended your contribution by urging schools to cultivate talents. But these are two opposing concepts. So I would like to start from the second remark. Being transversal does not mean that you must know everything about everything. You must be transversal when it comes to thought. I refer to the concept of having an overall view and being able to connect the dots, to connect the various points. The US companies use the terms helicopter view. They like to give this material definitions. So helicopter view means having a view from the distance and from above. So having the sense of the complete topography. And this enables you to have a clear picture of the reality you are about to tackle. And it also enables you to have a clear understanding of your talent, your skills, your competencies, and how they can be used for the benefits of the reality you are experiencing. So having an overall view and then being also able to collaborate with the other groups. This is another very important characteristic and skill. This is one of the most complicated skills you may have. Because overcoming the individual, overcoming individualism and listening to what other people have to tell you, because they can give you an added value, well, this is a complex task. So these are not two opposing concepts, they are complementary. The one paves a way for the second. So you can pave the way for your skills and talent to become deeper and deeper. As for the first concept, how do I understand the features of the people? I don't think there's a specific recipe. There is definitely no specific recipe for this. I think it's more of an attitude. But this is not something which is genetic, which is innate. You can nurture it. The first feeding of this attitude is observation. You need to observe people to understand if a person has a skill or an attitude of a certain kind or of another kind. And this can also be carried out with expertise, with your experience. It's a topic, it's an attitude you can feed in time with experience. And it stems from the simple consideration that often in the companies, people are not hired for the specific job which is the most suitable to their skills. And this leads to frustration and to all the consequences. So one should always try and place people in a context where they can release their potentials. It's not easy, and it involves wearing the other person's shoe, and being empathic. This is what empathy means. The ability to understand what the person before you is feeling and what desires he or she has, what his or her ambitions are. And this empathy can be nurtured, it can be fed, and it is very important because you understand the features, the ambitions, the characteristics, and you can carry out a more exhaustive evaluation of a person. Then there's another aspect which is based upon my own personal experience. It has to do with me and the way I choose people and the people I choose. I could give you lots of examples, but I am impressed most of all by the positive persons, by optimistic persons, but not by people who are optimistic whatever happens, but people who are optimistic because they rely on their own energy, because they are willing to do something, because they are willing to question themselves, and even if they have if they don't have all the skills necessary, they are willing to change, they are willing to question their abilities. This is a fundamental aspect. This is an aspect I found in all the young people who in the end had had outstanding careers. I teach digital marketing, as I said earlier. I have a chance to observe all these of the students throughout almost the entire career, university career, when it comes to my own subject. So at the end, let's take 100 students, and I say these 20 or 30 students will have an outstanding career. And I managed to read in their eyes. They have a particular light, and it has nothing to do with intelligence or with being clever or with the mark that you get at the end of your university career. It happened to me. Well, I hired people who didn't get an outstanding score at the end of the university career, but they had a chance to, and they had the ability to work with the others and to collaborate with the others, and then in the end they were very successful. So you need to stay hungry, and you need to bear in mind all these aspects in order to have a clear and overall picture of the person before you, so as to empower all the people to release their potentials. Thank you very much for this answer. So my university degree mark was 105. So please bear this in mind for the future. A couple of questions for Matteo Marzotto. Well, my score was the lowest score possible at the end of my high school career, and I still have to get a university degree. So I was impressed with one sentence. When you said, I have never done everything, I've not always done everything right. But this is an element which, vis-a-vis the topic of today's session, is very important. What can save you from mistakes? If there is a concern of young people starting to work, is the fear to make mistakes, which maybe should be coupled or which goes in contrast with the fact of being able to run risks. So what can save you from this fear to make mistakes? And it has to do not only with work and with jobs, but also with what you're going to do in your life as a person. Then there's a second aspect, when you explained what it means to re-earn what you've inherited. You mentioned the commitment. But then it seems to me that when you talked about your own personal experience, along with your personal commitment, you also followed a pathway or indications left by your grandfather. So maybe this is another important aspect. Well, question number one, I don't know the answer. It's a question I ask myself every day. I'm still quite a young entrepreneur. I did make mistakes, and I can tell you that before making mistakes, I was more bold. I was bolder than I am now. And then it's a matter of your own conscience. Well, making mistakes is is something useful because it creates experience. And if you've just made a mistake, you will probably avoid making the same mistake twice. I don't agree on the belief that in the US you have a melting pot and then you can manage to fail lots of times and then in the end you become a billionaire. Well, we are in Rimini, we are talking to Italian people most of all, and as much as we endeavor to become multicultural, but the Italian situation is a situation we are confronted with. But I believe that some mistakes and some blows are maybe useful. And I talked about conscience, but I could also talk about humility. But being humble, intelligent persons are normally very humble, modest, and they are prone to make some self-criticism. They are ironic most of the times. My grandfather Gaetano, he said that you can feel a little bit stupid, but having some money in your pocket. I don't have the proper answer, but I believe that if you look at things in life by cherishing and by considering the mistakes you've made, you will not repeat the same mistakes. I totally agree with the previous speaker. I think that all the elements in line at that given moment to face that specific situation will never be present in life. It's like being 70 years old with all the experience of a 70-year-old man, but with the energy, with the physical strength of a 20-year-old man. It's not possible. So we will never have all the instruments, but at least with our experience, we will have acquired a little bit of cautiousness, a little bit of desire to listen to the others, and we will probably have learned from our mistakes. All these elements form a balanced personality. A few months ago, I was invited by an important Italian university to talk about fashion. And there were four other speakers sitting with me at the podium. Well, they were formidable when it comes to their own history. They were more formidable than me, that's for sure. So I tried to say that I was lucky enough, I was at the right place at the right moment, so I managed to earn my reputation in at least 2 occasions. Then, while I was saying goodbye to the headmaster, to the chancellor, I asked him, why don't we try to focus on the failures instead of simply focusing on the success, on the achievements? But he answered me, oh, it would be great, but he never called me back. This is a topic I mentioned before. These 3 outstanding people talked about their own stories, but the success story is the last one you tell. And I remember, since I know them, I remember that when they were working at the beginning of their career, 2 of them, well, I saw at least 2 of them crying. Just imagine what happened in 2008. So many of them had a period of crisis. They lost lots of customers, and so they really experienced failures as well. But they are only willing to focus on success. So I would rather recommend to go on by cherishing the mistakes you've made and by bearing in mind that you should always have some money in your pocket. You can tolerate 1 or 2 failures, but certainly not 7 failures in a row. Thank you very much.
Finally, a couple of points for Mario. You mentioned the speed of change in the labor market, and I thought about the expression that may have made people facing the labor market some years ago, when such a big mobility was really considered a dangerous thing. How could we talk about this change to a young person who is about to enter the labor market without making him or her afraid, and rather showing that this is an opportunity and to favor his or her energy instead of giving in. And linked to this, what would you recommend that these young people should understand in the trends of the labor market? You in the research centers listen to the world through the data, through the social media, through all the information opportunities that you have. But what about those people who just act individually and try to understand what's going on? So what is the evidence that they should consider about the labor market? Well, due to my role, to my position, I have the opportunity to have a dialogue every day with young people at a university. And there is a strong question, a strong demand from them that they also want to learn concrete things, more practical skills. What is the experience I have about having a dialogue with the young people who ask me about their choices? How is it possible to understand that mobility is a factor that can also be positive? It can also be an opportunity. First, it is important to consider that this is part of today's life. It is evidence of today's life. So let us help young people to be realistic. If reality is like this, then one has to understand that reality must be addressed and people have to go through reality, whether they like it or not. So people need to understand what is that can enable them to face reality. And I was really impressed by an aspect during my class. I was showing these data, I was talking about these factors, and I asked them, what can help you accept the challenge of change? Well, we're not talking about labor because you are they were studying, but in your life, what helps you accepting challenges? And this debate was wonderful because they mentioned the fact that a very simple challenge, a young lady said, when I enrolled in the first year of the university, every module was new for me, and I felt as if I was unable to do anything. Before such a feeling, I might have given in, or I could also just try to stay with a group of people who wanted to try to put themselves at stake. So over time, this becomes a method. So one big factor is about the method which is used to face challenges. What is the starting point? One should understand the ultimate goal that they have, trying to understand what is at stake. Young people should not erase the desire for a positive construction of themselves. So getting together in this endeavor is really important, and the relation between adults and young people in this respect is fundamental. How is it possible to understand trends? Well, trends should be more visible. There should be somebody that should make trends more visible, and this is something that is lacking in our society. We are in the information society, but we do not have a systematic approach to information. That's a big problem. And then I have another anecdote. I had a couple of excellent students who graduated with a top mark in the MA program, so they won't have any problem to find a job. They came to see me and said, "Can we have a chat with you, professor? We can't find a job." And I thought, well, that's impossible. What happened? So these girls told me about their job interviews. And while they were telling me about their job interviews, they told me that when they were asked, what would you like to do? What would be the unit in which you would like to work? And they said to me that they replied, well, anything. Anything, because we have no idea of what it means to work. And I stopped them and I said, so you didn't get the job? And they said no. So I asked them, well, would you hire somebody who has no idea about him or herself? And they said, well, but we do not know how it is like to work. So I told them, well, now go and talk to your friends who graduated before you and ask them what they do in their job, and we'll have another meeting in a couple of weeks. They went there, they had a dialogue, they had a chat with colleagues who entered the labor market, and they exchanged views on their experience, their duties. And when they came to me and said, well, I would like to do more this, and the other said, well, I would like to do more of that. So put it in your CV. The first statement in your CV, write what you would like to do. Is it true that you would like to do that? Yes. They wrote it in their CV, they sent their CV again, they were called, and they get a job immediately. More than understanding what a profession is, what a job is, what is important is to understand what one wants to do. That's why education is such a crucial aspect. Thank you. I would like to thank you all on behalf of the meeting and also personally, because, well, I don't know what you think about it, but I come to the meeting to meet people and stories like yours. So thank you so much for coming here. I would like to remind everybody of the fact that the meeting event is possible thanks to everybody's contribution, and it is possible to make a donation. In the halls, there are the Dona Ora desks. There is volunteers with a green T-shirt collecting donations. So thank you for your generosity and have a nice